Well, welcome to another exciting and informative edition of American Hot Rod Association Drag Racing History Channel.
Exciting and informative.
Yeah, I tried to get both of them in there at the same time.
Crunchy is also often good.
Crunchy and,
creamy. Well, but no, let's just talk gassers.
Let's talk gassers.
Let's talk
gassers a real a drag racing topic.
Well, Drag, the thing about gassers, right, is that of all the types of race cars that have come and gone, over, the 60, 70 years.
Right.
70 plus years. The gasser is the one breed of car that, has kind of transcended the sport of drag racing.
Right.
Where it's like it's in the popular automotive culture. It's like street rod guys, gasser. Rat rod guys, gasser. Gasser.
Well,
it's this big generic term.
Well, and I think it's because it was originally the very first go at the door slammers kind of situation for a race car, right? They originally started off as street driven cars, and then they kind of morphed into more of a drag car, but you could easily take something that was very gasser era-ish and then put it right back on the street, which made it simple and fun.
Well, if you go back to the earliest days of drag racing classification, you had stock.
Right.
You had super. Actually, gassers predate super stock, I believe.
Right, they do.
Okay. But you had people who were just modifying the cars in general and wanted to run. See, okay, here's the important thing. A lot of younger guys, people, and when I say younger, I mean people under 40.
Right.
They grew up in a world of drag racing where everything sportsman is primarily brackets.
Right, and it's already evolved, right? They didn't see the whole...
But that's besides the point.
Right.
They think in terms of sportsman drag racing, in terms of bracket racing. Handicap, roll your own, dial your own, or index racing.
Right.
Okay? And what they don't really understand, what they don't grasp is that when drag racing got started, there were no brackets.
Right.
Everything was, it was run what you run with a handicap start in everything but that.
And there was no index, right? What you did was you set national records, and then everything was based off of national records, right? So you'd have a handicap start if you raced two different classes based on the national record.
Right.
If you could run under the record, hey, great. But generally, that didn't happen at that time.
So initially, you had your stock type classes, right, and you had your full competition classes. And then there was the in between, the street and strip type of car, where the owner would make various modifications and whatnot. And that was the impetus of the whole gasser idea.
Right.
The gasser was originally basically a modified street car, and that was one of the criteria. If you go back to the classic glory days of drag racing up until the 70s, the gasser cars that fell under the heading of gasser had to have an interior. They had to have all the street equipment. They had to have a passenger seat.
Right.
They had to have upholstery. Right.
Right. And another thing is, gasser was the term itself. It comes from the gas class. The car had to run on gasoline to be considered, for the gas class. So you see today there's gassers, that more or less look the part, but an alcohol injected blown motor.
Yeah, let's get into a whole different thing.
I know that's definitely not the realm of it, though.
But you have a few different eras, right? Mm-hmm. So it's hard to pinpoint the exact. So the rules morphed as the eras changed, and the way the cars were set up morphed as the era changed. So if you go back to the 1950s gassers, right? They didn't look very much different than they didn't have a very distinctive look to them.
No, the earliest part I can find discussing gassers was in 1950 Santa Ana. They had a pure stock class. And C.J. Hart, who was at the time the manager of Santa Ana, who later moved on to Lions, he decided, hey, this isn't fair to run these cars against the pure stock cars because it's not pure stock. Mm-hmm. So he pulled them all out and he put these coupes and sedans in their own little class that were essentially modified coupes and sedans, right? And it got to be a big hit. But like you said, most of them were virtually a stock chassis and body,
right?
And they had you take your typical gasser stuff, the stance. The stance is 100% weight transfer.
But that came later. If you talk about 1950s gassers, or the original incarnation of gassers, you had a typical gasser of the era would be, let's just say, a 48 Studebaker with a flathead Ford or a small block Chevy swap.
Right.
Right. So it wasn't. They weren't radical race cars. They were just
Right. It
things.
was
Right.
it was a hot rodded car.
Right.
And at that time, you could have any engine in virtually any body.
Right, and because it's primarily a motor swap class, engine location had a lot to do with it too. Because
Right.
people will be swapping motors, and when you swap a motor, you don't necessarily put the new motor back where the old motor sat. So gassers were limited to a 10% engine setback. So basically, what that means is that if the wheel, in round numbers, if it's got a 100-inch wheelbase, you can set the motor back 10 inches from the spindle, the center line of the front spindle to the number one spark plug hole.
Right.
And the thing that set gassers apart from altereds, see, a lot of people think of altereds right away. They think of like Pure Hell and Nanook and Wild Willie
A
Bush.
few altereds.
Yeah, but those aren't actually. Those are a small fraction of altereds. Altereds look just like a gasser, except that the engine setback is 25%.
Right. Oh.
And they're a
so
little,
those were the ones with the engine inside the car, Jim.
yeah.
Okay.
Right. So that's the difference between a gasser and an altered. A gasser is 25%, is 10% setback, and an altered is 25% setback. Those are the main functional differences.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the altered allows you more body modifications. See, on a gasser, the body has to remain essentially stock.
Right.
So it had to have headlights, it had to have taillights, it had to have wipers,
Right.
it had to have a horn, it had to have all of the street equipment because it was a street class. And then later on, they were morphed into a thing called street eliminator, which is why they needed to have all of these street things.
Right.
So people think of the classic gasser as being this crazy radical thing, but it really wasn't. They were relatively mild looking cars. They weren't crazy looking cars.
Right.
They were limited. The body was limited to a maximum of 2-inch top chop,
Okay.
which was a very common thing back in the day in the 1950s.
Right.
If you started screwing around with a car, one of the first things you did was chop the
Yeah,
top.
it didn't cost you much. You just
Right.
chopped it up and welded, or well, you didn't even weld it back, and you leaded it back together. If you just brazed it and then leaded it in.
So those guys, it was such a common street modification that in order to accommodate them, they allowed,
A
like
chop.
very minor body modifications.
Right.
That was like the 1950s. As you got into the 60s, the rules stayed the same, but the cars started to get a little more wild, and you start to get to that.
Well, they started thinking bigger, right? Within the rules, but what can we get away with that's going to help performance?
Right.
And that's where you started getting all of the characteristics of the gasser that everyone thinks of.
Right.
Right? The standard raised front end, right? Which
Right,
is
straight
all,
front axle.
right? Which is all about weight transfer, right?
But now you see, that's the other thing. Common conception is that gassers, as a rule, had a straight front axle,
Right.
and that's absolutely not the case.
I'd have to say majority of them were spring risers or whatever you want to call them.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. The higher class. Remember, you got to go back to the tires and the asphalt that these guys were running on at the time. The drag strips. The traction aspect of drag racing has changed radically, and there were a lot of different steps of evolution. So if you go back to the very early 1960s, they were running on regular asphalt.
Right.
They had very hard tires with stiff sidewalls.
Right.
So the name of the game there was to get as much weight transfer to the back as possible.
To get the tires to hook,
Right.
right? Which were a lot of them are recaps. If you look back at the older, pictures, that's where the pie crusted slick,
Sure.
that was your standard typical recap. That was generally what McCreary's or I think
Or Racemaster.
J.C. Penney's.
Yeah, J.C. Penney made them. Yeah, there were a lot. M&H. There were a lot of different slick manufacturers back then. But if you look at stock, super stock, factory experimental cars, and gassers from the era, they all had a nose up bias,
Right.
Not necessarily slammed up like this, but
Right.
slightly nose up to get that weight, to initiate the weight transfer to the back.
Right.
The gassers had what was the height?
There was
limitation?
the crankshaft centerline couldn't be any higher than 24 inches.
24 inches, 2 feet.
Right.
So measured at your crankshaft pulley, it could be no higher than 2 feet off the ground. Most gassers just sat at regular ride height up a little bit in the front.
Right.
And it was the lower class cars, like so gassers ran on a weight to cubic inch classification.
Ratio.
So A gas cars were like 6 pounds per cubic inch.
Right.
B gas would be like 6.57 pounds per cubic inch.
Right.
All the way to, if we see E, F, G, H, I, J, K,
H, I think was the 6 cylinders, right?
H was limited to 6 cylinders and flatheads.
Okay.
All right. But they ran on a weight to cubic inch basis. And the lower classes, once you get to like D gas, E gas.
Right, they're down on cubic
F-gas.
inch, right?
Right, you're talking about a 3,000 pound car with a 270 cubic inch engine.
Right.
So those things weren't able to actually to torque the front end up,
Right.
and get the weight transferred back. Remember, this is all manual transmission days. There were really no automatic gassers. Supercharged car is an exception.
Right. Well, that came later though.
Right.
But when you're talking early gas, most of them were stick shifts, and most of them were like budget junkyard stick shift. There was no crash boxes or dog boxes or anything like that back then.
So the name of the game to get the car moving was to rev it to the moon, if the valve float, however far it'll go, sidestep the clutch, let the 60-pound flywheel crash into the drivetrain and get the car to move. Well, you get a good initial hit with something like that, but then it would break traction if it didn't transfer weight. So that's why the lower the gas class car, the higher the front end tended to go. And those are the cars that we picture today.
Right, with the re-arched springs that are, it's literally at the 24 inch. And I believe they probably drew that 24 inch line right there, like, look guys, you go any higher, the weight transfer on the top end is so bad that you're
they're pushing all kinds of wind.
Right.
Right? Forget that you can't really see the tree, the bottom of the tree, but
Right.
you're pushing all of this wind upstairs. But it didn't matter to these guys because they needed to get it off the starting line. And the popular misconception is that all gassers had straight front axles. And that is absolutely not true. Most gassers had conventional, whatever the conventional front suspension was that they were running. A lot of the Chevy, like the quintessential gassers, the Tri-5 Chevy.
Right.
And most of them just had extended
Coil
springs and ball joint extenders. They used to sell the ball joint extenders that was like 3, 4, 5 inches tall.
Oh, wow.
Right, to actually be able to get the car to separate.
But that's a lot of leverage on the ball joint.
Yeah, it was, but they've only got to go in a straight line. And that was an advantage because it's lighter overall.
Right.
To stick with that stock independent front suspension and just taller coil springs and to hack it all out and then to go with the drop front axle and the leaf springs and everything. So most gas class cars of the day didn't really look the way we picture the gasser looking.
Right, like it does now.
Right.
Another big item for gassers is the fender well headers, right? That's where those really came from, was the gas classes, and a lot of it was because those cars either didn't have the floor pan clearance for full-length headers, right? Mm-hmm. Or a majority of them were engine swap cars, so there wasn't anything that you could have. It was easier just to come right out the side of the fender, and there was plenty of room. Definitely, if they were jacked in the front, right? There was plenty of room there.
The profile of the gasser started to change around 1967, 1968. Now, I want to talk about the different gasser groups.
Okay.
But in a minute.
All right.
They started to change with the wrinkle wall slick. Once the wrinkle wall slick came in, they started dropping the center of gravity of the cars because you didn't need that much crazy. And drag strips, almost all drag strips by that point were being paved with a compound called dynamite.
Right, which was tires.
Right,
up into the asphalt.
Tires, right, rubberized asphalt, and that was originated at Lions, another AHRA.
Yeah. Well, back to what you were saying was, like we've kind of toyed with the idea here at the AHRA to have a gasser event. We've played with classes. And what we noticed is there's 35 different gasser groups throughout the country, right? And there's 35 different interpretations of what a gasser should be or is, right? And you can't get them all on the same page. You can't do it. It's very difficult.
Well, there's two examples that come to my mind right away, and they're both like basically local groups,
right.
to us at least. You have the straight axle mafia.
Right.
Which is a bunch of great bunch of guys. They have a lot of fun with their cars. The only rule that they have is that it's got to have a straight front axle.
Right.
They really don't care. They're just out there having fun.
We hit one of the races last year at Hardinsburg, Kentucky, at US 60. It was a good time.
Right. But they're not really sticklers for any sort of specific thing. Where you have the exact opposite end of the spectrum with the Southeast Gassers Association, the SIGA.
Right.
Right? And they picked the 1967 rule book, and that's it. I mean, like, And it's one of the things I really admire about the Southeast Gassers is they cling absolutely religiously to 1967.
Right, the period correct. As Quinn Stott says, it's got to be period correct.
Right. To the point that they recommend, if you guys really, if you're interested in the topic, go find the Southeast Gassers Association rulebook. They're sticklers to the point that they tell their racers to keep their trunks closed. Because most of them have modern stuff in the trunks, like fuel cells and whatnot. You know, some
battery, lightweight battery.
Right, concessions to modern, you know, what you have. And they don't even want that. They don't even want people to see that in your trunk. So just keep the trunk closed.
Well, so here's where a lot of that I believe probably spans from. Southeast Gassers was one of the few groups that's actually running a weight to cubic inch program, and the cars. The whole intended thing is you have to make the car faster. You have to do what you can to make it faster, but it still has to fit that 1967 criteria.
Yeah.
And they've gotten faster and faster, and this year, Quayne, I believe he pulled shift lights out. You can't have a shift light in anymore. He doesn't even want the light going off anymore. You got to be able to really drive the car, that was what I had intended to do for the AHRA. When Nostalgia Modified, when I brought that one out, was all about driving the car, driver skill, right? Because that's what racing an automobile is about. It's not just get in there and hang on. Right? Anybody can be Bebo the Chimp.
Oh yeah. Well, like for instance, like most gasser groups allow automatic transmissions.
Right.
Where the Southeast Gassers, well, you're going to pull to them. You got 3 pedals on the floor.
Yeah, and it doesn't. You're not allowed 5 speeds or Doug Nash's or Blinkos or anything.
They want H pattern.
Right.
3 or 4 speed shifter.
Yep.
Right. So. But anyway, it was the wrinkle wall slick that kind of changed the complexion of the sport, and at the same time, it was Ohio George Montgomery.
Ohio George, and that's where, in my opinion, that if you're thinking gas class, that is the territory. That's gasser territory.
Right. But Ohio George, he had been running a 33 Willis at the time. He pulled the Willis body off.
Right.
And he plugged a Mustang body onto the thing.
Onto the 33 Willis chassis.
Right, and that changed the whole complexion of the whole gasser thing. At that point, the late model bodies started to come in. The cars previously, because they wanted full frames within the gas class cars, and beginning in '68, they were allowing aftermarket ladder frames. So the gasser kind of evolved into a left-hand drive, 10% engine setback funny car.
Right. Well, and that's where. See, 68, when they started allowing the modified frames, that's when the wheels were starting to come off the bus at that point. That's when it opened the doors for unibody cars, right? And the ones that came in and smashed everything that I could think of would be the Opel GT.
Right. Well, I mean, you
had the Cadet before that, but the GT was the one that really changed the game.
Well, you still had your Anglias and
the Austins and the Henry J's, yes.
Right. The 90-inch wheelbase cars, and that was a big difference between the NHRA and the AHRA, right?
The AHRA they were allowed to run the 90-inch wheelbase cars. NHRA was running 92-inch wheelbase cars, which kept all those little ones out.
Until what, 1969?
I think that was the end of '67 for when they changed that for the NHRA. The NHRA also ran a 6.0 pounds per cubic inch versus the AHRA allowed 5 pounds per cubic inch, right? So, but that was where the big differences between the two.
Now, you also, so you had your regular gas classes, and then you had your supercharged gas classes. So regular gas classes ran A through H. And again, H being for inline sixes and flatheads.
And the one A gas supercharged.
A gas, B gas, and C gas supercharged. There were 3 blown gas classes. And even that designation changed over time because it went from A gas, B, and C supercharged to double A gas, double B gas, double C gas. And the 2 letters designating that it had a supercharger. But along those lines, you had people like Ohio George Montgomery and the Malacott brothers.
Rudka brothers, yeah.
That were all running, well, the Rudka brothers were just running superchargers, where Ohio George and...
he was playing with turbos.
Turbochargers. The Malacott brothers were in there, like, I guess 1966?
That Mustang they had, was it a Mustang? No, I'm sorry, they had a Willys that had 2 turbos on it.
Yeah.
And
With a 331 Chrysler.
And then was Ohio George had was a shotgun Boss motor with 2 turbos?
That was later on. Yeah, actually, he was roots blown until the shotgun motor come out, and then with that they also went to the twin turbocharger. But a lot of what we see, like the gas classes, were where the roots of drag racing turbochargers.
Right. Well, I kind of look at it as it's the forefather for what is Pro Mod today. Right, because a lot of the things that they're doing in Pro Mod now were all originally tested or attempted in gas class.
But the evolutionary step, pre-wrinkle wall, post wrinkle wall, is where they started to become really funny cars.
Right.
They would have tilt noses, and then the rest of the body would lift up like that. They had left-hand drive. It's a funny car with 2 seats and a 10% engine setback. But if you ask me, those are the best looking of all. Like a lot of people prefer that nose-up attitude, and I always thought that the cars,
the 68
and 69, 70, I always thought those were the most beautiful cars because they slammed the back of them down. They had these giant wheels on them, and they opened the radius of the wheel wells all the way to the trunk lid.
Right.
And the cars just looked absolutely savage.
Well, at that time, you didn't have anything that looked like that. There was no Pro Stocks that had back halves. That would have been probably your most aggressive looking race car at the track, minus a dragster or a funny car. Heaven forbid one of them show up. It was only 2-3 years into the class.
Right.
So your gas cars were just about everywhere.
So as time went on, the gas classes fit into several different eliminators as time went on, and they ended up in modified eliminator.
Right.
And the NHRA, and by the time you got to the middle 70s, they started to look like pro stock cars, like light duty pro stock cars.
Right.
It had really changed the complexion of it. By the time you got to the end of modified in the NHRA in 1981, 81, they had lost that quote gasser look, but they were still crazy cars because they ran on. And so NHRA dropped modified, but IHRA kept running modified until 1987.
AHRA ran modified through the end of the AHRA's first. Really their first attempt, so through 84.
Okay.
Right.
But I was crewing on various funny cars back in the middle 1980s, and I remember we'd be at an IHRA event like Darlington or at Bristol, and you would hear them run the first pair of gassers, you know what I mean? And I'd drop whatever I was doing, I'd be right back, and I'd go run to the fence and watch a couple of them because they were just the greatest. It's all of this 11,000 RPM, sidestep the clutch. Second gear by the tree, right? I mean, these things were just animals.
638 gears.
Right, yeah. And that was, but basically 1987, Billy Meyer, who was a funny car racer back in the early 70s, bought the IHRA, and he eliminated all of the classes except for funny car, top fuel, and pro stock, and turned them all into brackets. And that was the official end of the line as far as those. Now, when did the AHRA?
AHRA actually, Jim Tice passed away, and so then his wife and their son ran it for another year, or another 2 years, which would have been like 84.
Yeah, so that would have been 1987 was the end of the line of the traditional gasser that started in 1950.
Right. Yeah. Then he had started having the nostalgia drag racing is what really brought it back.
Right.
The gasser. They were the first ones I remember seeing. I went to the first Holly Hot Rod. Well, I don't know if it was Holly Hot Rod Reunion. It was just Hot Rod Reunion, I think, in Bowling Green in 2003. And the gassers were there. That was the first group I'd seen was the Geezer Gassers.
Yeah.
And the old handshaker. That was the one I really liked because it would stand on the bumper and the sucker was fast.
But the gasser worked its way into the public imagination. Even people who don't know the term, like regular people who don't know the term gasser, are all familiar with like the Rat Fink type of cars.
Yeah.
And the shirts, they were all the rage in the 70s, and still to this day people, it's always the image of the car way hell up in the air in the front with the headers hanging down.
And that's one thing we didn't talk about was the gasser wars themselves drove multiple other things.
The
right?
camshaft wars.
The camshaft wars, yep. And a lot of your National Dragster, Drag News, all that stuff. There was every weekend after an event, there was a new flyer with a new gas car that would be standing on the bumper, and hey, this is Ed Iskandarian's, piece de resistance,
Right. Well, that all lived. Okay, so the pecking order you had, right, in the what I call the golden age of drag racing, which would be like 1960 or so. It's like 1971, 1972. The pecking order during the prime of that golden age was you had your top fuel cars, right?
Right.
And you had your gassers. Now in between you had funny cars, but they weren't a recognized class yet, not until 1970.
Right.
So your official pecking order, as far as the big sanctioning bodies, was your fuelers and you had your gassers. And so the match racing was supercharged. The A-gas, B-gas supercharged cars were like the headliners for match races all across the country.
Right, and that's really where it got started was, your Big John Masmanian versus Stone Woods and Coupe.
Yep.
And that was, even now I believe that got turned into a painting a few years ago at Lion. It was a picture that someone had painted,
I've seen
right?
it.
But it is one of the quintessential. You think Gas Wars? That's what you think of.
And along with the gas wars was the camshaft wars, because each of those named gassers that were touring the country
had a camshaft manufacturer.
Had a camshaft manufacturer. So it was like the camshaft manufacturers that take out these full-page ads in the magazines,
right?
Bragging about their car's kill record.
We set the national record. It's 2/10 below what it was, and then the next week the new paper would come out, and then there's something about Howard's Cam. The new Rattler just set the whole entire record down at this.
Yep.
It was unbelievable time.
Right. The funny car excluded. It was the most colorful and interesting period of time with the most colorful and interesting people.
Well, there was a lot of big names came out of just the gas classes themselves, But I think a lot of it was, if you want to know really there's a lot of good books out there. There's Gasser Wars and Gasser History, but if you look at the big thing as a whole, out of the whole entire country, a lot of it was from Ohio.
Ohio was like ground zero for a lot of stuff.
Right. It was all driven around that area. That's why Ohio, George Montgomery, that he won 59 U.S. Nationals in Detroit in a car they built only 2 weeks prior to the event. Then he went back up in 1960, same car, and wrecked everybody else again, right? And the car was so far ahead of its time that here it was a year later, same car, pretty much just doing the same thing. But that's what started the whole thing. The Hrudka brothers ended up they were the ones that made the Mr. Gasket. Yeah, and then that's what a lot of people are familiar with today is Mr. Gasket, but that it all comes from the Gasser Wars and Gasser era time.
Yeah, it was great stuff.
I know, I love
amazing stuff. We could talk about this all.
I know. We got to let them go.
People are clicking away now. I have enough Gasser. I've had enough.
Yeah, I'm tired of Gasser. Let's get on to something else. So we'll see you. What?
Oh, wait, let's. The next thing we're doing is.
It's going to be funny cars. Funny cars, correct. And we're going to have a guest speaker.
Who's that?
Steve Magnante from, it was from Hot Rod Magazine, from Barrett Jackson Auctions. Mm-hmm. He's the guy that knows everything about everything muscle car, but he's an
encyclopedia when it comes to early funny cars. He's actually built a couple of them.
I was going to say, he's secretly in love with that era. Unbelievable.
Secretly.
I guess it's probably not a secret.
Yeah, no. He's obsessed with that area. He's built a couple of altered wheelbase cars.
He daily drives some altered wheelbase match bash cars.
I think the funny car thing we're going to have to break into two separate videos or two separate shows, because that you could do literally a whole hour on just
the first generation.
Pivotal 1965, 1966 match bash period, up until the flip top cars, which only lasted about 2 years. But that's where Steve's real knowledge base is.
Okay.
And then after that, you start to get into the flip top cars and the funny car revolution of where the funny car actually started to take over.
You're talking American about the mongoose and snake era.
Right. Where every kid in America knew who the mongoose and the snake was.
Exactly.
They were all racing their Hot Wheels cars, and it was an amazing time.
Well, we'll catch you next week with funny car video on American Hot Rod Association Drag Racing History Channel. Don't forget to visit Uncle Tony and Uncle Tony's Garage. Buy some of his merch at UncleTony'sGarage.com.
Yeah. And then every Wednesday night, we do Wednesday Night Tech Talk live at Alice and I. And we'll be doing our first one from here at the shop this coming weekend.
This coming Wednesday.
Yeah. This weekend. We got a lot of stuff. A lot of stuff going
busy.
on. Yeah. So in the meantime, like and subscribe and share and do all that other stuff. And
don't forget to hit AHRAonline.com and buy yourself some merch or a membership so you can help us out.
That's it. Let's get out of here.
Yeah. See you next week.
See you later.